My brother and I lived alone with my grandparents. This is because my dad passed away when I was young, and our mom was a drug addict, unable to care for us, so we stayed with Gma for our time being. One night, me and my brother were in our room, talking about the legends of skinwalkers, when all of a sudden, I swore that I heard a rock hitting rock outside. This is right outside the house, the front door specifically. We both looked out the window to look down at where it was coming from, but it stopped, so after that, we kind of just wrote it off, going to bed. When we woke up the next morning, we were going outside to see if there were rocks anywhere, but we got out of bed and looked out the window. It looked like something big had ran through our backyard, trampling everything. At first, we could see shadows moving, and it soon kind of materialized and looked like a large person, or maybe some sort of large animal. If somebody was running that fast, they would have made some kind of noise, or at least broken things down in the house. But there were no signs of those things. So what do you think it is? Possibly a skinwalker. Is that what skinwalkers do? Maybe it was something else. Like I said before, my mother's an addict and usually is too high to know what's going on around her. This is why I live with my grandmother. She may have brought home something with her, may have something that hurt us. I just don't know anymore. I never did tell my brother about this day, but he did see it, and swears up and down he saw the same thing that I did. He's not serious when it comes to what people say is real or not, so I think he may have seen something else. If you're familiar with skinwalkers, you know that they usually come when you least expect it. And I can't forget about the smell. My brother and I woke up one morning to a horrible stench in our room. It was like death and decaying flesh, which was pretty much what we thought were skinwalkers. I'm not saying that's what I saw, but we saw something. Also, our grandmother had forewarned us about skinwalkers, and to not speak of them. Maybe we really did encounter one, after all. My story does not include the time that I was chased out of my car by something when I attempted to get an image on film. This figure dissipated. First off, for some context, I'm Navajo and live on the largest Native American reservation in North America. I grew up here. The reservation is large enough to be split into 3 states, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, and populated with close-knit villages that are very much self-sufficient. Many people still live in traditional hogans. There's a lot of culture and tradition passed down from our elders. Our reservation also has its own distinct flavor and culture, though it shares much in common with other native tribes. We have our own dialects and cultures within the greater native world. The story I'm about to tell you takes place at one of my favorite spots on the res, Monument Valley Tribal Park. It's located on the valley specifically, where you can stand on a sandstone cliff that tower 1,000 feet over the valley floor below. There are various trails throughout the park with mind-bending views in every direction. I've been going there since I was a kid. My family still hunts in that area every year. It's a very special place to me, a sacred site, a place where us natives can go to connect with creation and the Creator. I'm bringing this up because it's also one of the most remote spots on or near the res, though not far by the road. You can just drive there. You have to get off the main highway onto dirt roads that are barely passable without 4-wheel drive vehicles, except for when it storms. Then, they turn into impassable rivers of mud, snow, and sand. So many locals abandon their cars and hike out, or call the park rangers for rescue when and if they get stuck. It's a treacherous drive under normal conditions, in my experience. To add to the point about remote location and difficult driving conditions, I grew up in a nearby village, nothing like Monument Valley, which is close to the Arizona-Utah border, but still basically in the middle of nowhere. And when you're that far from home, even with cell phones, it can be an incredibly long time before anybody hears your distress signal if something happens to you on one of these roads. Just food for thought. It was here that I had my own skinwalker encounter. Something was watching me. Something that smelt and looked like death wrapped in dark, tattered robes. I was fearful. This was also in the evening time. I did not want to stick around and find out more of what this creature or being had to offer me. It was trying to lure me in. almost like it wanted to give me something. A gift is what I perceived. I wanted no part to play in its dark magic. I stay away from there now. Me and my friends were driving home from a party, and we had to take this dirt road. Our lights went out, and we saw the same figures that my friend described in her story that she had told to us. We were too far afraid to get out of the car, so we sat there for 30 minutes before our lights came back on and these figures disappeared. When I got home, I told my mom about it. She freaked out, said there was a skinwalker sighting nearby, and also there when she was growing up. We live in a pretty small town, so stories like this can accidentally fly under the radar. Well, one night, my friend was staying the night at mine, and she woke up in the middle of the night to see a figure standing above her, looking out from the window. When she screamed, it just disappeared into thin air. I think this skinwalker has been trying to get to my friend since she was young. Her family never believed her. I wouldn't recommend wandering into the woods around here late at night. Even during the day, if you have a dark shadow that haunts you, it's probably a skinwalker. In fact, my aunt actually was haunted by a skinwalker for many, many years, and she's a medical professional and doubted the stories for a very long time. The skinwalker would bang on her house, move things around in ways that could not be done by humans, shine lights into her windows at night, and eventually, it got to the point to where she wasn't comfortable going home. I think that during the time she was actually living with us because of how uncomfortable she had gotten. This thing will mess with you, and it can become extremely aggressive. I wouldn't recommend messing around with skinwalkers. They're dangerous. Just trust me on this one. I hope that's enough to sway you from wanting to investigate these kinds of things. Once you mess with them, they will never leave you alone. My grandfather told me about the time he went to Bear Lake with some friends when he was in his early 20s. His friend decided that they wanted to set up camp on the other side of the lake, which was much further away than my grandfather liked, due to safety reasons. He begged them not to go, but they would not listen, and began their journey across the lake. As you can imagine, things weren't going well for them. Their boat motor broke down in the middle of the lake, leaving them stranded and far from help or shore. My grandfather said, "Screw it, I'm coming over there myself." He put out on a life jacket, got in a personal raft, and began rowing towards his scared friends. Halfway across the lake, he saw something on the shore, a grayish figure on all fours with black eyes. He got out of his raft, quietly rowed towards it, being very careful not to get too close. The closer he got, he realized what it was. A skinwalker. Something that had been haunting Flagstaff for years by then. When my grandfather arrived at his friend's campsite, they asked him what had taken so long. Why wasn't he making any noise? When my grandfather informed them, they immediately packed up their stuff and went back to town in a hurry. My grandfather said there were many more stories, but this one had stuck with him through time. He knew these beings were flat out evil and had no good intentions. I had just graduated from the police academy in Farmington, New Mexico. I was called out to check a report of a cougar chasing children on the Navajo reservation. This young officer had no training in wildlife, nor had ever seen a wild cougar, so when he arrived at the scene, he was not prepared for what he saw. There were two large dogs approaching him, growling with their hackles raised, fur standing straight up along their backs. As they came closer, he realized that these dogs weighed about 140 pounds each, and they stopped 15 feet away, snarling, threatening, while continuing to glare him down. Now realizing that these were large animals, this new officer drew his weapon, but before he could fire, one of these creatures took off running into the woods. The other gave him a second glance, scooted its rear end back briefly, dropped to its belly, and kind of almost awkwardly got up on two legs with a strange gait, and kind of disappeared. This officer never saw what he thought was a dog before or since that day. Not like this, anyway. Although this account is certainly interesting, it lacks any support, evidence whatsoever. There's this sense of dark magic looming all over this area. Although, while his report is pretty outlandish, it's not too outlandish if you spent time in this area, and you know that there are shapeshifters and skinwalkers all over the place. This was believed to be a duo of shapeshifters, and trust me, a measly 9mm handgun is not enough to scare them away, or an officer. They'll be back all right. This story takes place in 2012. I was just a sophomore in college. My then girlfriend and I decided to take a late-night drive down the main highway. This runs through the reservation on our way home from a visit to a nearby town. There's not much to speak of between our village and anywhere else, so it gets dark very late at night, which few streetlights or other signs of civilization are around. It can really make for a creepy thing. While we were driving around, one blind curve on an otherwise straight road, there was this massive coyote standing on its hind legs right next to my car, just looking at me while I drove past it. Who knows how close it actually got, but I had some space around me for obvious reasons. Next thing I knew, it wasn't there anymore. It was like it had teleported off on the road. The most bizarre and unsettling part about this whole experience, besides how close we were to whatever that was, is that I did not hear a single thing. No growling, no scuffling, nothing. Just silence, and then it wasn't there. It's still hard for me to believe that something can be next to your car one moment, but gone the next, without you ever hearing a peep. Especially since my windshield was down at the time. I don't know exactly what people think about that night. People have told me stories to what I've experienced before, but never with such detail or immediacy. I have always considered myself to be a skeptic, but even the most cynical among us must admit there are things in this world that we will continue to doubt until they're proven beyond any doubt. My girlfriend and I both felt a sense of terror. I feel like that's what it was. It sounds silly now, looking back. Neither one of us really knew anything about skinwalkers at the time. We didn't know what we saw wasn't real, but a Urisk or other type of force spirit. After some more discussing it for some time, we decided not to tell anybody about it, besides our friend, since he had already heard stories from our village before. None of us could understand why something would want to scare us. I wish we had known about skinwalkers then. Maybe it wouldn't have seemed so scary or unusual. Maybe not. My mom and sister were driving home from a wake in Farmington, New Mexico. It was about 3 a.m. They were driving down this highway, and all of a sudden, something ran out onto the road in front of them. The car hit whatever it was. It rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. They got out, expecting there to be a dead animal, but instead found a person standing in front of them completely naked. She had no hair, also no teeth. Her skin was very pale and looked very strange. She did not say anything, just stared at my mom and sister like she wanted to eat them or something. My mother informs me her expression was very unnerving. They both sat there staring back at her for several minutes until my sister finally broke the silence. "Are you all right?" My mom then said that the girl looked at her, started screaming really loud. It was terrible and frightening. They both jumped back in the car and drove out of there as fast as they could. Now, my sister swears up and down it wasn't a dream or even sleep paralysis. She will never be able to sleep again because of what she saw, or drive that section of road. She did tell me, though, of a time that she was haunted by one of these things in her sleep, though. When she was younger, her and her boyfriend were sleeping in the same bed. She started getting woken up by this feeling like somebody was watching them. So she opened her eyes to check out what was going on. And there, staring back at her from right over the edge of the bed, where her head would be under the covers, it was a person's face. No teeth or hair, just pale skin and very skeletal looking, almost hovering above. She eventually stopped seeing these things, but never stopped feeling that awful sense of terror in her room. In fact, she believes this thing followed her around, that there's an evil presence lurking in her life. In 2012, I was employed as a forest ranger patrolling St. Joe National Forest here in Missouri. I was responsible for law enforcement aspects of the job. During this time, my patrol area included what is now Springfield Branson National Airport, also commonly known as KSGF. My first night shift on duty, sometime between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., I patrolled around KSGF before returning to my assigned Ranger District headquarters near Hollister, just prior to sunrise, right around 4:30 a.m. Well, a few weeks later, at about 16:30 hours, I responded to a report of a teenage male subject who had been attacked by 3 unidentified canine creatures while camping with friends along Big Creek, only about 1 mile east of Highway 86, which passes over Highway J, about 3 miles north of Hollister. The subject stated that he had heard something moving through the brush. He first believed it to be a deer or raccoon until the unidentified canine creatures emerged from the woods, surrounding them, yellow eyes and looking somewhat humanoid. The teenagers initially tried to drive away, but weren't able to. Their vehicle was surrounded, and they were abandoned. After being attacked, they fled into the surrounding brush, but their pursuers followed them to the brambles, where they continued running for some time, before finally escaping by climbing up a very steep embankment along Highway J, then cutting back down Big Creek towards their campsite. The father of one of these youths telephoned my office on discovery of some large paw prints left behind by unknown animals at the same location only days after the incident. I had previously spoken to him during an unrelated investigation, so he had recognized my name on caller ID when I called him back. I immediately went to the location, Highway J, where he had previously showed me these large paw prints in the soft dirt embankment right along the shoulder less than 24 hours earlier. The father explained that they couldn't be certain of what made them, but were concerned about their proximity to his son's attack, which was only a couple of miles away, as well as some strange events at their farm several weeks prior. I found 5 different sets of tracks left behind something very heavy, having long strides and non-aggressive behavior, leading down across Big Creek through a thick underbrush before Highway 86 towards an adjacent property. These tracks were all more than 14 inches in length, 7 or 8 inches wide, and right and left hind foot impressions. Upon following the tracks up to their point of origin, I discovered a series of very large barefoot human-like footprints from which these tracks originated. It was like something had walked through Big Creek and into this man's property, without leaving any visible sign that it had crossed over into his property, except for some strange human-like footprints left behind in the mud, all along the creek bank. Am I saying it's a skinwalker? I don't know. Is it possibly a Bigfoot? I don't know. What's odd to me is that the subject described these canines as very humanoid-looking, in the face, not just how they moved and acted. It leads me to believe this was a gang of shapeshifter or skinwalkers, but I can't be 100% certain. That's what the witness and subject believes. Hello, my name is Evan, and one day, during the month of May in 2010, I was in the desert with my father in New Mexico. It was right around 2 in the morning, and we saw something dark in the hills moving toward us. It looked kind of human, but it was on all fours. As it got closer, we realized it was not a human on all fours, but an animal that stood up like a man. We first thought it might have been somebody passed out or hurt, and then we seen its eyes glowing yellow, and we knew right away this was nobody in a costume or a person. My dad ran as fast as he could to the truck, tried running back there too, but before I can get past those hills, whatever it was came up from behind me, chased after me until I finally made it to the truck. Its eyes are forever burned into my memory. I have never seen anything like that before in my life. It's not something I ever want to see again either. You know, the desert is very quiet at night, the bushes being so silent, the way they sway back and forth. The only thing you can ever hear are the coyotes howling in the distance, or maybe even a howl hooting away, but nothing too crazy. That was until I had seen this dark figure who stood upright on 2 legs, much like a man would, running towards me from far out within the hilltops of New Mexico. My father ran back to his truck as he saw whatever was running, gaining on me. I tried to follow after him, my father. But before I could get past those hills, whatever had been coming up from behind me nearly got to me before I fled. My father and I have no idea what it was, but we believe it to be a skinwalker. I had just returned to the States after serving in the military in Afghanistan. I was living on my parents' farm, just outside of town. I had just set up my own outbuilding for my new workshop. It was late summer, hot, but not too humid. It was about 1:12 in the morning. I decided to step outside for a shop for break. The night sky was clear, filled with stars, but there were no clouds that night, which made it very bright from the moonlight. I sat there for a moment, enjoying the peace and quiet, when I looked over and saw what I thought was a star moving across the sky, until it became very apparent that this star hadn't been there, and was now getting larger and closer. This thing continued in its path right over me, heading towards a wooded area behind my shop. As it approached a tree line, I noticed there were two bright white lights, about the size of small beams in front of it, what I can only describe as a gray football-shaped mass. The object was completely silent, gliding close to treetop level when it passed over me. I could see all along the bottom edges of this thing. There were rows and very dim lighting coming from within. I stood in complete awe for a few moments, and realized something was happening here in the woods where the object was headed. So I ran inside and tried to grab my video camera to record this. Not much is clear though, but you can see enough of exactly what I saw. The object comes into a clearing where it slows, just hovers there for a few moments, then slowly descends into the woods. It could be seen briefly just below the tree line as it disappears from view. I waited on my porch for an hour or more hoping to see some more signs of activity, but nothing ever returned. So I went back inside to get some sleep. I had been working pretty much non-stop since getting home from Afghanistan. If only this thing would have given me something to show. It never did though, and that was almost 10 years ago now. No one has ever really believed me until I found this website and started reading other stories and realized that yes, I'm not alone. Now, here's the other thing too. In conjunction with this, there's also been a mass uptick in skinwalker sightings all around here. It seems that somehow, UFOs and these beings are somehow connected, and it still haunts my memory. Something else I should include is a story from a friend. He sent this in to me, and so I will share it with you. It reads this. I was camping in the Aberfoyle region of Ontario with some friends. It was around 2 in the morning. One of our friends went to relieve herself. She came back rather quickly, white as a sheet. The rest of us had asked what had happened. She just told us that she saw the ugliest thing. It was about 7 feet tall and covered in white hair. She says whatever it was looked at her and disappeared. Our friend has never been the same since, or camped since then. This was a camping trip in northern Arizona. Me and my other friend who were driving down from Utah were camping at this lake. We had been there for about 3 days, but one night, me and him are going to go explore the place around the lake. The sky was pitch black, except for a crescent moon shining through the high thin clouds. We went on our walk, leaving our other buddy back at camp sleeping. As we got closer to the dark side of the huge mountain, that you can see pretty much everything on top of it. It is some sort of plant or shrubbery. I saw something moving. I took off faster than any human possibly could, running up into the forest right next to us in less than 5 seconds flat. That's when I also heard heavy breathing and a low guttural growl. Me and my friend heard it, and we began walking fast and did not stop looking behind us until we were back at the campsite. We told our other friend to pack up and get in the car. We felt like something was going on. Something was following us. When it got really late, I began hearing what sounded like huge feet stomping on stones all around the forest. It definitely wasn't an animal from around here. There was no sounds of anything I was familiar with. I think, and from what my buddies speculate, this had to have been a skinwalker. I know it might sound absurd, but that's about as reasonable as anything else in my opinion. My 2 friends who were with me swear that they saw one, and they're not lying either. They've mentioned it before. If you don't know what a skinwalker is, Google it. I'm not going to go into an explanation. I don't want to talk about this anymore. If anyone knows if they're real, please tell me. It would be appreciated. The last thing I want to see is a huge black shadow with eyes and a bloody mouth hovering over my tent at night. This story takes place in South Dakota. We were staying in a tiny cabin on the top of a hill from an old ranch. Late one night, as we're all sitting around the campfire and drinking beer and smoking weed, our friend's brother came running up from behind, chasing something, swearing he'd seen a massive cat or lion-sized animal running into the woods. Naturally, we were all joking about him tripping on something, but not long after, he came back up and swore he had seen this massive black humanoid running low to the ground, disappearing into the tree line at the very bottom of the hill. Now, we were all freaked out, so we decided to go looking for it. It was dark and there shouldn't have been anybody else around. We got down there, found nothing, then split up, which was probably our first mistake. As soon as that happened, I saw what I guess you'd call a light anomaly, or shimmering in some trees maybe 50 feet away. It appeared kind of like heat rising off tarmac, except it sort of moved both right and left, and up and down. At this point, I was terrified and quickly ran back to the group who were both still searching for something. I told them what I'd seen. They went back with me, quick to show everybody else, which by this point was now really freaking out. The shimmering disappeared as we got down there. After about 3 minutes, it appeared again in the same spot, only now different. It's hard to explain, but instead of moving through the trees like before, it now kind of stayed still, making no sounds other than our footsteps. We all saw it flicker on and off several times throughout 10 minutes or so. One guy even tried luring it over with a lighter, but nothing happened, so we decided to go to shelter in the cabin. At this, my friend told us he'd seen the shimmering in the small lake on the other side of the cabin, right about midnight. Safe to say, we all slept with the lights on that night. Who knows what kind of creatures, like skinwalkers, were looming out there. I was camping up in Washington State, but before I begin, let me make clear that this is not a joke or some BS made-up creepypasta. This all happened, for real. I went camping at Big 4 Ice Caves on September 9th, 2015. My best friend as well, who is also a very avid camper. On our way there, we ran into some ridiculously foggy weather, and it got to be about 5 inches away from us when we finally found the spot we wanted to camp at. Now, this spot was at least 10 miles away from any road, so nobody would bother us. We set up our tents, and before we went to sleep, I had my good buddy stand guard outside while I slept. I was pretty sure there were other things out here. We took shifts. On the 10th day, I awake to what sounded like a girl screaming in pain, followed by strange thumping noises. At first, I figured it was one of my friends just playing a trick on me, but that idea faded when they didn't answer back, and I yelled at them. The scream started. Whatever was out there sounded closer than ever. There were definitely multiple people shouting in unison, with all sorts of voices. This continued for about 20 minutes, until the thumping noise got even closer, and the sound of trees snapping came into the mix. Right before I fell asleep, somebody whispered, "Come with us," really close to my ear. But I was already so exhausted, I just ignored it, sleeping right through it. The next morning, I woke up and noticed that my friend was not outside on guard duty like he said he would be. Alarm bells started going off in my head. I made a lot of noise to wake him up. When he got out of his tent, he looked dazed, as if he had no idea how or why he was there, instead of being outside where he said he would be. He had bruises on his arms and legs, which were also bleeding pretty badly. We went back home immediately after this horrific experience. We didn't want to be out there anymore. We found out later on that the area camped at was under investigation as a hotspot for skinwalker sightings and encounters by a paranormal researcher team. We also had heard voices of our other family members and friends during the time we were out there. More so my friend than I, but he would later on tell me that. The whole experience was downright terrifying. We'll start at the beginning. My friend and I used to play together as kids, hunting ghosts in abandoned buildings, cemeteries, etc. The usual childhood fun. I had always considered her a very good friend. We did everything together back then. It was hard to stay mad at each other for long, even when we went through some really bad stuff, or we were being stupid making bad decisions. So one time, one of my other friends comes along with us on a ghost hunt because he wants to try and take pictures. And we're sitting there talking, my friend and I, and we get into a little argument about something. And all of a sudden, she kind of froze up, like she was distracted by something else. She kept looking around the parking lot while occasionally glancing at me with this look of horror on her face, but wasn't really saying anything. I asked her what was up, or maybe she saw something. So after asking her if she saw something weird or whatever, it took me a second to realize that my friend had stopped talking too, and wasn't even attempting to take pictures anymore. He too stood there staring off, like nothing. Literally nothing. Every time I asked him if he saw or heard anything, he just acted like he didn't say anything and continued to stare off. My friend was the same way, both turning back, expecting either everybody else had vanished or they were playing a prank on me. But there was nothing. Just an empty parking lot with tattered up old brick buildings surrounding it. So I can't really explain what happened, but it will always stick out in my mind as one of the few times I was never able to come up with some sort of explanation for what I was witnessing. Well, I should say what they were witnessing. I didn't see anything. They both got even more nervous and told me we need to leave now. I just went along with it and we left. Well, in the car, they both stayed incredibly quiet, not speaking much of a word. After pushing their buttons enough, my friend didn't say anything, but my other friend, the girl, she said that there was a large coyote watching us from behind one of the buildings, that it had glowing red eyes and was very, very tall. Taller than her dad, who's 6'4". She told me she instantly knew deep down in her gut we were being watched by a skinwalker. I was scouting out in Idaho in the Sawtooth Mountains. This was just a few weeks ago, and it is very desolate where I was. No towns or anything for a good 20 miles. I had my dog with me, off a leash, which is very rare as he isn't the most obedient of dogs, but I felt this was right. Besides, there wasn't anybody else around for miles, so no big deal, I thought, right? He started acting funny as soon as we came within about 5 feet of this dark object that seemed to be embedded into the ground from an old landslide about 15 feet away, just down a small incline. He would not get any closer, even though all I could see was stones that were kind of radiating dark blue. We got a really bad vibe off it, the closer we got and the more we inquired about it. I quickly scanned my surroundings because, after that, I no longer felt safe. But I didn't see anything else, so I grabbed my dog by the collar and began to walk away. Just then, I started hearing noises around me, like something big was coming. My dog looked back at it 3 or 4 times before we got back on our ATV that had all of our supplies. Once we were up on the seat, I felt a lot better, but when I looked back, the stone was gone. I tried not to think about it for several days, because when you do, your mind starts running through every conceivable scenario, even though you know what you saw is impossible and ridiculous in today's society. From what I gather from other natives, this was a skinwalker sigil. Even though I'm still confused and kind of want to go back there. So, even though that's what I've heard, does anybody else know what this could have been? Because it's kind of driving me insane. Around the time I was 23 years old, my family moved from our home city of Las Vegas, Nevada, up to Utah, where we lived for another 5 years. The area we were moving into was surrounded by rocky hills and cliffs on all sides. On top of one of these mountains resided What I thought at the time was an abandoned mine, which we often explore during the summer months. We found old, crumbling cabins and mostly useless tools, but nothing much more than that. One day, while exploring this very mine, we had all heard loud shrieking noises that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I took off running back to the cabin where my family was, but they asked me why I was breathing so hard and what terrified me. I couldn't tell them because, at the time, I didn't know myself. Well, about an hour had passed, and we decided to go looking for my sister, who had now gone missing shortly after she had wandered away from us, in search of some type of animal or something that she could show her friends later. I didn't catch it all. Now, keep in mind that this area wasn't exactly friendly for kids, wandering around due to the cliffs and rocks, so, as was feared by having such dense brush and even rattlesnakes, steep terrain, we were unable to find her. We had to end up calling police for assistance, which prompted a big search party of at least 50 people to enter the mine looking for her. Several hours passed before she was finally found after wandering into another abandoned mine. This was much further down on the mountainside. It was impossible to see from outside these old mines. Now, every time I think back on this experience, I can't help but feel as though it wasn't an ordinary event. Something inside me tells me there's more than meets the eye. It also happened around October or November, if my memory serves me well enough. Although these things are hardly ever exact, because of how easily memories are transformed or misplaced. But anyway, when I talked to my sister about it, she claims there was this one large tall shadow that kind of looked like a large dog, she said, and it lured her into the mines. She claims that it kind of had a hold on her and was almost controlling her the same way a puppet master controls a puppet. Very eerie. Was this a being, an alien, a skinwalker? I don't know, but it certainly creeps me out. We were camping at my friend's house, but decided to go inside once it felt too creepy outside this night. We were all just hanging out there, and his mom was there with her 2 dogs. There is a window right above where the couch is. We always leave it open, so the dogs can go in and out of their little kennel thingy outside during the night. So, my friend's mom goes upstairs to get something. Seconds later, she comes down super fast and tells us we have to go back outside now. Well, once I saw her face, I jumped up. It looked like she had seen a ghost or something. When I began walking towards the door, she said, "No, not that way. Go out this door." We do what she says, but our dogs are already inside at this point, so we couldn't just let them stay in there while we went back outside. She said to get in the truck, and she would be out in a minute. So we did. We waited for like 10 minutes before our friend's parents drove up. His mom was in the passenger seat, but I swear it looked like she was holding something that kind of looked like a dog. It wasn't moving, though. Her face is still haunting because of how horrified she looked. I asked my friend if he saw what I saw, and he said yes, what you were thinking. So whatever it was ended up being in the car with them when they left. This stuff always happens at my friend's house, so whatever it is likes to visit him. Not every so often, but enough to freak us out a few times a year. I swear, if this is true, my friend's mom used to work as a 911 dispatcher, so she knows what she saw and heard that night just as well as we do. I've been trying to find out if anybody else has ever seen the thing near the woods, but no luck. My friend has also claimed that sometimes when he looks at his mom, she's possessed by a skinwalker, that it'll look like she's holding a dog in her hand or part of a dog, like a dog's skull, or that part of her flesh is becoming canine and looking like she's holding a dog. It's hard to explain, but as if some of her limbs and body parts are becoming canine, which would make sense and resemble why it looks like she's holding a dog. Really creepy stuff. And she'll also just say things that are completely out of her mind, like telling us we needed to go outside now and go into the truck, when there was clearly nothing out there. It's like she was having a methed out episode, even though she never does meth. I don't know. The whole thing is very strange. I'm not quite sure what to think about it. I don't want to exactly entertain the idea of skinwalkers, but it's just very, very strange. I'll let you come to your own conclusions. I've had a sort of paranormal life experience since I was a child. I don't know if it's because of my family or just it's natural to my bloodline. But my father would tell stories about his own childhood in which he was missing chunks of his memories, but he believes they may have been taken away by something. He said there were usually other people with him who had disappeared from time to time, as well as he could never remember who or accounted for when looking at photos. It bothered me a lot growing up, especially the night terrors. I often experienced these where I'd wake up screaming and feel paralyzed, unable to move, feeling like something or somebody was holding me down or on top of me, although I'd seen nothing. What really had solidified my suspicion about something being off, however, was seeing the things for the past few years. I have a great deal of curiosity about this world, and often seek understanding by reading books on different subjects, and going to museums, etc. So naturally, when I saw a book in the used bookstore about theories surrounding skinwalkers, I was intrigued and brought it home with me. While doing research for a school paper later that evening, something caught my attention. It was from one of the sources where I had seen what looked like an animal skull painted silver, hanging from leather straps attached to a ceremonial-looking bead, leading up to 2 lines coming from its mouth, appearing to be reptilian teeth. I knew what this was. It was not an art piece, but something very, very real. It was a ritualistic ceremonial tool, used to draw on evil spirits, although primarily used to expel them. But this object attracted them. And at nighttime, I would have these terrors of seeing this tall, humanoid shadow staring at me from my room, just looking into me from the window. It's hard to describe in words how much fear you have when you feel like something or somebody is constantly watching you. I just have a feeling that this is a skinwalker, and I know it's been spying on me every single night. I don't know what its plans are, I don't know what it wants to do to me, but it does not feel good, and there's a lot of times I simply don't feel safe anymore. So I moved out almost 2 years ago, and one time, I saw what appeared to be an arm coming from around the tree, almost touching the window, as if it were simply trying to pull the window open. It was a long, white, deathly-looking arm. Deathly pale, of course. With my mother's passing, I've come to peace with some of this, and more so than ever, I want answers now. I feel there is a very real connection between these spirits, paranormal, and the supernatural, and what one would call UFOs or extraterrestrial. As we all know, whether you are religious or not, there's no proof that denies both them exist. At least on some level yet for years, people have been ridiculed into thinking that anything paranormal does not exist, just because it can't be explained completely by science yet. So therefore it must not exist? Well, the house I grew up in had a history of fire and death, and I often confused our activity with that, however. After time, I realized it wasn't the same. My mother's passing was unexpected, definitely traumatic, though in no way believe it is the cause of this activity, which is always seeming to be around me. Now, my older sister lives there now, and my father passed away in 2009. She swears up and down that she'll move out when she gets enough money for a place. Something about not wanting to live in fear, yet never leaves her room at night, nor does she ever leave her shades up. And I've seen some strange lights in that room many times. Odd shadows, but mostly on the ceiling. But more than anything, have heard insanely odd things that I can't explain. It still makes me feel very uneasy to this day. Fortunately, I'm in college now, and no longer live in the house, but I found myself trying to find information about whatever it is we're all experiencing. I mean, speaking with others about their experiences is all a part of the learning. I believe we're being haunted here, and not just by ghosts or poltergeists or demons, but by actual demonic spirits, like a skinwalker, for example. Part of me wants to know more. I want proof of what I've seen and heard, although part of me, deep down, does not. I'm afraid of finding out too much, especially considering my sister's reluctance on wanting to know either, and the fact that she believes there are spirits or ghosts still lingering around her, which keeps her up at night, and even though she swears she sees nothing, she can hear and feel something staring at her often, the same way I could when I lived in that house. But I can say with 100% certainty that what we and I have heard and seen has changed our lives forever. I was returning from one of my research outings, eager to bask in the glory of the day's findings. I had spent most of my day exploring an old abandoned cabin in the woods for any clues about maybe past inhabitants. The only things I found were dated furniture and a few empty liquor bottles. That was really all that's left, besides other trash and graffiti. There was no evidence of anybody living there or being there recently, or at all. But something felt off. The feeling that I was not alone followed me around like a fog, much thicker than the one accompanying me through these parts. It was late evening when I decided to pack it up for tonight and head home. My car sat right off the main road on an overgrown dirt path, not somewhere you'd expect to find anything other than thick vegetation and lots of mosquitoes. I pulled in, spotting my friend's car already there. She had called me earlier today, asking if I would take a look at something she thought could be paranormal. I was only too happy, as it gave me an excuse to explore more of these woods that had always intrigued me. Getting out of the car and grabbing my backpack filled with gear, I noticed something odd, but could not put my finger on what seemed off about this scene. I immediately shrugged it off as nothing and proceeded over to greet my friend who was standing by her car, talking on the phone. Before heading into the woods, where she said she saw the activity, I was halfway to her, when I too stopped dead in my tracks. That strange feeling I had earlier came creeping back, but this time, it was accompanied by a cold chill and goosebumps on my arm. The air felt thick and heavy, and I could hear the crackling of fire, followed by the faintest sounds of chanting coming from further within the woods. This combination gave me an eerie feeling, making my hair stand on end. Something wasn't right at all, but before I could process it fully, something just drew me into these woods, as if under some kind of spell. I knew I had to be cautious and watch my back, in case whatever it was there decided to follow. But for some reason, I felt confident that this feeling would not hurt me, and that's when it hit me. The air didn't just feel thick. It also smelled like sulfur and rotten eggs, along with rotting meat and garbage. But surely, such a smell couldn't be coming from only one source. It was overwhelming, almost making me sick to my stomach, whatever it was. The chanting became louder, and the crackling of fire grew even ever closer, until we came upon a small clearing, revealing another old cabin. This had a ring of lit torches surrounding it, and piles of human bones, placed neatly in rows on either side of the door. It took everything in me not to scream when I saw this, and I realized what was causing the smell was not hidden in the shadows, like my instincts had told me, but standing right there in the clearing, wearing some kind of animal garb around its waist like a loincloth, holding an intricately carved wooden staff. My friend's phone fell from her hand when she turned to me with fear in her eyes and began to back away slowly. I must have looked just as frightened. What happened next sent both of us running out of the woods for our lives. This figure turned to us, and we realized this was somebody, probably a witch, with an adorned animal skull covering their head, covered in animal cloth, and began chanting at us as if they were casting a hex on us. We fled safely back to our car, locking ourselves inside before starting the car and leaving. We're very thankful to even be alive. I was the only person home, so it had to be me. I was in my room with the door shut, and it happened around 5 p.m. Central Time. As soon as I turned off my bedroom light, which went out shortly after turning it on, because there was a power outage at the time, I saw a shadowy figure come into my room through the window. This window is always unlocked, and not only that, but also opened slightly. This is how I cooled down my room. And as quickly as it came in for a split second, it stopped, looked at me from across the room, staring intently with black eyes, close together, and kind of with this menacing expression, as if it didn't see me. And then it noticed me, and wanted to kill me. It, or he, stood there for what felt like forever. Then all of a sudden, it kind of made this grin, and disappeared out the window, as fast as lightning. I was too scared to move, yet somehow I managed to get under my covers. Then, right before I fell asleep, which somehow I almost managed to do, I could swear that I could feel his face come across the bottom of my bedroom window. This has been a reoccurrence multiple times, and the other times, instead of a black shadow coming into my room, I will see this kind of lanky figure approach my window and just stare in. When I see this person, it looks like a man covered in war paint with glowing yellow eyes, covered with wolf skin, maybe like a Native American warrior, or so it physically reminds me of. Is it possible that I'm being hunted or haunted by a demonic skinwalker spirit? Or is this just some sort of witch? This has been going on and off now for the past couple years since living here. I'm terribly frightened. Although it doesn't happen every night, it's often enough to where I feel like this guy or thing has it out for me, for whatever reason. Nobody else in the house I live in has these issues. It's only me. So it really makes you wonder, is there any sort of curses or blessings I can get to counter this? Can you counter a skinwalker with other curses? Do you need any sort of sigil, ornament, idol, or object at all for any sort of protection? I've heard salt works, but I'm not too sure. I've already done and blessed the house with sage. That doesn't seem to really work, at least from my experience. I've had a friend that had a very similar haunting, I guess you can call it, and it worked for him. For me, it seems like whoever or whatever this is can change shape between a physical being and a demonic shadow being, or so I think, which is why all results come down to a skinwalker, I believe. But I could be wrong. If anybody has answers, please help me. So this happened a few months ago, but here goes. I live in a very rural part of North Carolina. We have a lot of forest around us and lots of wildlife constantly going through our yard. One night, me and my boyfriend were just sitting outside on the porch, just casually talking. It was about 8 p.m. and already kind of dark. You know how it gets when it's dusk out, where the sun kind of just lingers in the sky, and the sky is kind of a red, purple, hueish color. It's beautiful. There were no lights on inside of our house, so everything was pretty much just shadows. We were now facing our gravel road that came from the back of our house and leading into a wooded area. We saw something walking on two legs down the road. It wasn't too dark, at least not so much that we couldn't see it, but we got a pretty good look. At first, I thought it was another human walking towards us, but it stopped in front of a tree, right near one of the horse fences, and began sniffing the air like an animal. We could tell by the way its head moved that it was smelling for sure, the same way a dog does when it sniffs the air, except this was clearly a person. It did not have a tail, and the more we kind of looked at it and the more our eyes adjusted, it appeared to be a person in animal skins or something, because we did not see a snout, although whoever it was definitely acting very strange. Since we lived near a bunch of farms, mostly soybeans this time of year, there is usually a lot going on with smells anyway. They get fertilized, etc. After having his nose to the wind for about 30 seconds, he stops and his whole body changed. He went from looking at us to being completely turned in our direction with this look that I have never seen before on a human or an animal. He was big and very broad, but his head looked small in comparison to the rest of him, like a bobblehead. His legs were muscular and was bent over at the waist with his palms against the ground. It looked like he could spring forward at any second. His skin was more blackish gray, under the light of the moon, kind of like if you burn tree bark until it's black, but more smooth and coarse. When we locked eyes, he was not looking up though. I knew there was no way he thought I was another, because it felt like we connected in some way, but not in a good way. It was the most intense, eerie feeling I've ever felt, and I can't really begin to describe it. We were just sat there, frozen, staring at each other. This went on for probably 5 seconds, but I began to be concerned. There's no way he could have heard us, and we weren't making any noise. So if he wasn't looking behind him before, how did he know we were there? It was like he all of a sudden just knew. We both jumped up, running inside, turning on the lights, turning off the porch light. He stopped where he had been sitting, staring in our windows for another second or two before disappearing in the woods, as quick as lightning. It was definitely creepy. The only thing me and my boyfriend could come to was that he was possibly some sort of shapeshifter. So we immediately jump on the internet, and we're trying to do all the research we can. We looked at things like Dogman and Bigfoot. Didn't exactly fit. UFO, Mothman, again, did not fit. And then we came across Wendigos and Skinwalkers. This did seem to be a person wearing animal skins, so all of that led us to Skinwalker. I couldn't exactly tell if he was native or had war paint on or what, but we saw enough details and how he was acting that it was definitely giving off very bad vibes. I really do think this was some sort of Skinwalker. I've heard many stories of the Skinwalkers from where I lived. The Navajo people say you can tell a Skinwalker by their reflection in a mirror. They don't have one. Anyway, my friend that I was hanging out with said his family owned a very large ranch and that he would show me. He said it was really far back into the mountains. Not many people went there because of all the weird things going on. We got to go to his house, but nobody was around, so we killed time by taking a nap. In the middle of our nap, we heard howling noises coming from outside. We got up to look, thinking it must be coyotes or something, since these were farm animals being kept nearby. As soon as I looked outside, through the window, I saw a huge wolf that was on its hind legs. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. We both got so scared we ran back inside, locking the door. We figured if it had front paws like a dog, but the height of a man, there was no point in trying to outrun whatever it was. It's not like we could shoot at it. My friend did not have a rifle with him. While we were waiting for the creature to go away before we left, suddenly, my friend's father came through another door asking why we were here. Not only did he own this place, but he also hadn't been any werewolves around this area, ever, according to him. He had overheard us. Needless to say, this place just gave me the chills, and we quickly left. I am aware that there is a mass Native American gravesite close by, within a mile or two. I wonder if the wolf creature we saw has anything at all to do with that. I live on the Navajo Nation Reservation, and some nights ago, in early September of 2014, there were 4 of us hanging out at my friend's house. We were drinking beer. 2 girls and 2 guys, all in our mid-20s, which is old compared to the teens who usually do this kind of stuff. We were all sitting in front of the house, around a fire pit. Nothing but darkness behind us. It was raining pretty hard outside. All of a sudden, we noticed something moving against the fence toward the back of my friend's property. Oh, I should also include, even though we were all sitting by a fire pit, this whole area is covered by a very large and tall awning. This way we can be out here and not get rained on, and also not get smoked out. At first, I thought it was a stray dog, but as it got closer, I saw that its hair was matted, and it made a strange sound. My friend even said, "Dude, there's something grunting by your house." He heard the leaves crunching. Not sure what they were from, but we were all certain this skinwalker seemed very familiar with what he was doing. My friend's sister came and walked out of the house to see what was going on. She heard some of the commotion. This thing ran 20 feet in one quick stride, turned around, and looked right at her. I did not even expect it when she screamed. I only heard the leaves crunching, which is how he'd been moving. And this time, though, we were all sitting exactly where we were before when this whole thing began. When she screamed, we all ran into the house and grabbed our 2 guns. The skinwalker was literally just standing there outside by a tree, staring at us through the window. No emotion on his face whatsoever for about 5 seconds. And he slowly walked around the house, tapping it with his claw. My friend's parents have seen him walking through here before in broad daylight. All of us were sober, and we all know each other well enough to trust our testimonies. We're not stupid, and we're not going out drinking and being like, "Oh, I saw a skinwalker." Some people do, and they probably just want attention or thinking it's cool. We all still talk about it every day when we see each other. It freaked us out pretty bad, even though we knew what was happening. If you ever get to meet one of these things, your life is basically over afterwards, or so it feels like. It's like you've seen something really close to death or God himself, whatever you believe in. But usually, they prefer hunters' kids around my age-ish and family pets. It's often easier to catch them, and we're more important, I guess. Don't drink or smoke out in the woods around this time, especially not at night. You very well might draw these things in. They will know when you're high or inebriated, and they like that. It makes you weaker since you are under the influence. In 2016, this took place near the Pine Barrens. My family, friend, and I were driving home late at night. We'd seen some weird stuff out there before, including cult activity, but that's a story for another time. This time, though, we didn't see any of that really, but it's what my friend saw on his property. He lives not too far from me. That spooked us all pretty good. He said that he was walking to get something out of his car, and all of a sudden, he hears heavy breathing behind him. When he turned around to look, of course there was nothing there. But the bushes were moving, like somebody had come through them. This continued on for about 10 seconds and stopping right before the road curved towards the house. We all got chills. Both our houses are in clear sight of where this happened. I was going to walk back there with him, but he said no. We told him we'd come by the next day and stay out of there with him for a bit, just in case. I did not sleep that night. This is not the first time I've had weird disturbances outside when something like this has happened. It's always stayed on my mind. A few months later, he moved into another house with his girlfriend, and he saw the creature. At least thinks that it's what he saw. But more on the encounter story later. He says that this thing would come up to his house every night and taunt him. It would slowly drag its hand across the house paneling every night, right around 1:30 in the morning, like clockwork, and never failed. And one evening, he got so frightened and fed up, he went out into his shop, grabbed his shotgun, and got ready, filled it full of buckshot. He didn't plan on killing this because he knew it was a skinwalker and knew it was part human, but he definitely wanted to intimidate it and scare it away. It stopped coming around after that, but then appeared again about 2 or 3 months later. Sometimes at night, he would hear it calling his name in his girlfriend's voice. It would be this crackly, distorted form of his girlfriend's voice, but it would scare the heck out of him. Now, his girlfriend also worked the night shift, so she was never home from about 7 p.m. to 5 a.m., the prime time for this thing to stalk him, which it did many times over and over again. There were times that he got so fed up, he felt like he was going mad, going crazy. What can you do? Call the police? They're not going to believe you. They'll call you crazy, threaten to take you to the nut house, which is what they did to him. He tried shooting at it, but this thing simply alluded to the shadows. Why it marked my friend, I'm not sure. Why it had something out for him, maybe it had plans or something. Maybe there's a reason it had marked him. To my knowledge, he had never done anything or told me he had done anything to piss it off or aggravate it or insult him or her in any way, shape, or form. But I could very well be wrong. It seems like this thing didn't want to kill him, just torment him. He and I both talked about it, and we believe if this thing really wanted to break into the house, it could have. So why didn't it? Why was it so bent on just torturing him and tormenting him psychologically? What did it get out of it? Is adrenochrome really that special and obsessive for skinwalkers and cryptids? Do they really get off on fear the way everybody says they do in these encounter stories? Well, after a while, he eventually convinced his girlfriend to move closer to her work, which they did, only staying in that house for about 8 months. Well, after that, all the encounters stopped happening altogether. And thankfully for me, I haven't seen or experienced anything like it either. As an 18-year-old student studying in the US, I took part in an international exchange program. I was sent to live with a family friend who lived on 40 acres of land out in the middle of nowhere. We have no neighbors within 5 miles, so we're completely secluded by nature. It's not unusual. It's very rural. People don't come around here too often. And it's all good, if you're from the city like me. Now, there were only 2 rules placed upon my stay there: that I did not go near any of the 4 ponds that dotted the property. I saw this as an adventure. And that I made sure to lock up before bed, right around 9:45 p.m. Easy enough. Well, it turns out they had every reason to make these rules. Among the many fish ponds on this property, one was slightly larger than the others, and it was surrounded by thick, dense trees and shrubs. It had a very deceptive depth to it. It looked shallow, but would go down deep enough that I could not even touch the bottom. A few days into my stay here, I spotted something in this pond that seemed out of place. About halfway into this thing, there were what appeared to be legs sticking out of its side, which made me look twice. And one night, I saw what appeared to be a large dark figure rising out of the water from the very center of the pond. And I don't mean just climbing out or swimming out, but actually almost ascending and levitating out of the water surface, to where it did not even touch the surface of the water, but instead landed on the shore, like it hovered out of the water. It was incredibly creepy, and I tried to ignore it the best I could. I didn't think it was appropriate to say anything, so I kept my mouth shut. Tonight, at about 7:30 p.m., I was relaxing inside after doing my homework in front of the fire, and I heard one of the family's German shepherds begin going frantic crazy outside, barking. Sounded like she had come in from being out in the yard, and something spooked her pretty badly. As soon as I heard her barking outside in our direction, I informed my boyfriend, who also lives there, to go see what was wrong. He has an intimidating presence for most who don't know him. He's 6'2", covered in tattoos. He might seem like a thug, but he's a good guy. He goes outside to calm her down, comes back in a second later saying, "You need to come take a look at this." And I look, and I could see something huge and black darting across the yard, right over by where the pond was. The same pond that I saw this same dark figure arise from just the other night. Whatever it appeared to be was very, very large, and it worked and moved like a human being. I stepped outside and saw exactly what had scared them both so badly. On the front porch, what you might call a large man. It stood about 6'5", which is tall. Jet black hair down below its shoulders. It looked sort of like a demon, and its eyes shined and glowed red in the darkness of the night, while it showed its pearly white teeth glistening in the moonlight. They were razor, tack sharp. I was terrified, but this thing didn't seem to notice us. It's as if it was looking around for something. That's the impression I got. Then boom, it bolts off back to the pond from where it came from and disappeared. My boyfriend quickly pulled me inside and shut the door. We didn't see anything else during that night, and all seemed calm and back to normal by morning. The following morning, though, the dog had completely disappeared. I think whatever was in the pond came out and grabbed him, possibly took him down into the pond, and God only knows what else. I made a friend while I stayed there. He was a neighbor, actually, and he claimed that this whole time, the whole region around here for a few miles have just been very strange. Apparently, back in the day, the natives have hexed and cursed this part of the land for the mass amounts of murder that took place here. I guess there was something of a skirmish or a battle back in the 1800s here. Over 50 Native Americans died, including a very infamous witch doctor. Now, I wasn't able to find out who and names and whatnot, but that's just what I was told. And supposedly, on his last dying breath, he placed a curse on this region of land. Now, I only experienced that one strange monster sighting. I call it a monster. You might call it paranormal, or supernatural, or whatever it is you want to refer to it as. But this neighbor was telling me about how sometimes the sky will get dark for no reason, and the strange fog will creep in. Sometimes you'll see shadows out in the trees approaching the houses, and then vanish. Sometimes you'll hear metal scraping and other loud screams off in the woods. Just all sorts of unexplainable, creepy, paranormal things. He all thinks it's tied back to the hexing, but I don't know. I'm not much of a superstitious believer like that, but it might be tied to whatever that creature is that hides in the pond. The neighbor is also a very firm believer in Wendigos and Skinwalkers, believes there are several of both that live around here and come to visit all the houses from time to time. He says he's seen both of them himself, and even told me, after all of this, before ever mentioning anything to him, that there's one that lives in the pond, the one that I was referencing to. He didn't specifically say if it was a Wendigo or a Skinwalker, but made it out to be that there is some sort of demonic entity that's taken up residence deep in the pond. We had just crossed a main road when I realized there was this figure to my right, slightly in front of me. It was off the road, alone in the darkness. We had passed the farmhouse where the gas station attendant lived, but the figure seemed much closer now. The car had slowed down involuntarily as I looked at it. It was then that I realized whatever it was wasn't human at all. It had an incredibly thin build with long legs and arms stretching several feet into the air. For some reason, its smooth gait didn't seem to be walking as much as gliding towards us in a very jerking fashion. The blackness surrounding whatever this thing was melted away when I turned on my high beams in order to get a better look at what we were dealing with. When I did, my heart nearly stopped. This was clearly not a person, but an entity. Its body was grotesque, thin and gangly, with no features really whatsoever, except for its long appendage-like limbs. I couldn't see any nose or mouth, or anything on its face other than eyes. It did have large pointy ears, reminiscent of a distorted-looking coyote. They seemed very off, very unnatural looking, and this thing moved like it was very robotic. The skin looked dark and leathery almost, as if it was stretched over the bone forcefully. Its body looked beaten and broken, like it was just an abomination, or maybe it was a long, lanky body that had now been run over by a large truck. It was disturbing to look at. When the car stopped, it stopped, standing completely still in the darkness, just watching us. I couldn't see its feet or legs anymore. They might have now been invisible for all to tell. But something told me they were still there, planted on the road, and we had to stare down what was for probably a couple of seconds. It felt like forever, and it jerked into motion with this weird gait that I thought earlier wasn't walking as much as gliding. It then made a huge lunge between continuing down the highway perpendicular to my car's path of travel. We watched it as it swiftly passed some ethereal barrier of light. Then, we could no longer see it. I don't know what that thing was. A being from another dimension. A demon. I'm not exactly sure. We were all pretty scared by what we saw. My one friend is convinced it was either a demon, a Wendigo, or a Skinwalker. What is your opinion? I used to live up in Alaska. I've heard many tribal member stories of the Kushtaka, or Skinwalkers. I've always had a remote interest in them ever since. Anyway, this one happened when I was actually living up there with my grandmother, on their town. This was outside of a small town called McGrath. My great-grandparents bought this land way back when to raise reindeer, and worked for a company that raised a variety of different animals, like pigs and horses. Now they're long passed away, but the family still owns the land. My mom lived out there from around age 12 or so, until she moved to Anchorage for college. She lives down here now, to about 2 hours from home. She's been gone from McGrath for about 8 years now, at least I think. Anyway, she said some stuff has happened there over the years, while she lived out there. She said that her and her late grandma would stay up all night sometimes. They were too afraid to go to sleep for some reason. Not sure what it was at the time. I guess she hasn't told me since. But she would inform me. They would stay up until around 3 or 4 in the morning, until everybody else woke up during the day. My great-grandmother said the dogs would not stop barking until they got up like something or somebody was after them. Now, that only happened a few times, but that's when I first started hearing stories about stuff happening out there on their land. This one story happened after I'd moved out there with my mom for whatever reason. I've been kind of in an accident or incident with a guy who thought it was wise to drink and drive, so I had to move out there for a few months. But that's another story. Anyway, I remember this like one time. It was like 1 or 2 in the morning. My mother woke me up, saying she heard something outside. It seemed like she always heard stuff at weird hours of the night or morning, which is understandable. It is dark as heck during those times due to it being wintertime. She wakes me up and says, "I hear something outside," or something along those lines. We looked out the window but didn't see anything. We went back to bed, maybe 10 minutes later after sitting there, listening if we could hear whatever it was again. So, about 30 minutes later, around 2 a.m., she wakes me up again and says that she hears something again. We look out the window, and this time, we see a red light slowly moving down this hill towards the cabin. We lived in like a 2-story small cabin, and we watch it, and it stops at one point and starts flashing and rotating, and then moves forward again, stops, rotates in another direction, and starts to move up the hills into these trails, going into more of the thick forest surrounding us. From what I remember, there's about 3 to 5 feet of tall bushes lining those trails. If you were walking through them, you'd be able to see almost everything on the other side. So we watched it for a bit as it moved up each of those trails, until its light finally disappeared from our view, which was about 20 feet from the cabin, from what I can remember. All these trails had a lot of dead leaves and pine needles on top, which you could hear crunch under your weight if you walked on them. We're listening for that, but it never happened. We sat there, waiting to hear something out for another light out of the darkness, but nothing ever came. So about 30 minutes later, I think give or take, it was about 3 or 4 in the morning, she wakes me up again, saying she heard something else outside. We look out the window, and this time, it's still pitch black, and like nothing could even be seen through our view, until she listens very closely. But all of a sudden, she moves the curtain to her left, and exclaims, I'm trying to look at whatever it was that caught her attention, and I finally see what she saw. There's this big wolf-looking animal, standing on 2 legs, staring at us, right through our window. This thing was huge. It looked like a large black wolf, and large fangs. It had to have easily been over 8 feet tall, and was very, very stocky in build. And it had these bright, glowing greenish-yellowish eyes, which seemed to reflect in the light from outside. After a few seconds of staring at each other, it kind of just scoffed and turned and walked off, over by the bushes to the side of the house, not making any noise whatsoever. So we're sitting there, watching where it went, but can't see anything, so I suggest maybe going out there to check if it was truly gone, or what. And she starts freaking out, saying no way, about 100 times. She's not going anywhere near that thing. So we just stayed inside until dawn. After going outside to look around a little bit, we didn't find anything out of place or even unusual. I understand this story has now gotten pretty long, so I'll try to shorten the rest. Basically, ever since then, she would hear something walking out on our roof during the weird hours of the night. Nothing ever came of it. We never caught a glimpse of whatever it was. She would hear it walking but never stomping. Always with light steps, which was weird. There's nothing on our roof that could have made those noises either, unless it's something up with the cabin itself for some peculiar reason. That happened about twice a week with varying amounts of time between events, usually with one occurring around 1 or 2 in the morning, and another around 4 to 5. I assume they were during the same 2-hour span each night, since they had this weird pattern as far as time went, except the fact that they were random days of the week, and not always every week. After trying to talk to some local people around here, turns out some other friends of ours apparently saw a very similar creature, just a few days short of my mom's. Really, I don't know what to make of it, but I can say that what we saw was very real, and it happened in the fall. It started with hearing these loud thumps around our cabin. Many of my friends tell us it's the Kushtaka, the skinwalkers that live up here, the demons that feed on fear. But that's not all of our experiences. There's been other nights where we've also had very strange matters go on. There was one night I remember in particular where I was really struggling with insomnia, so I stayed up late watching TV and drinking hot tea. And I remember it was probably maybe close to 2 in the morning. My mother was snoring, kind of annoying me, so I kept turning the volume up. And I'm watching TV and drinking my tea, and out of nowhere, the strong smell of feces hits my nostrils. I'm appalled and begin looking around. I can't find a trace of it, but it seems to be filling up the room. My first thought, the sewage is backed up, and I run to the bathroom. No trace of it. The smell isn't even in here. So I figured maybe it's a pipe that has burst underneath the cabin. I'm kind of frantically looking around, and I hear a really loud, very low-pitched sound. Imagine for a second the screech or scream of an elephant. Now drop that sound in pitch by about an entire octave, and that's what it sounded like outside. Like this deep, bassy, thundering war horn. But it didn't sound like an instrument. It sounded like it came from something organic, like a creature. I got a really bad feeling that washed over me, and that really freaked me out. I ran and tried to wake up my mom, but she was so dozed out. Waking her up was pretty tough. I think she kind of woke up faintly but fell back asleep. When she's out, she's out. There ain't no getting her up. I realized I was probably just on my own, and I had to accept it. The strong smell of feces disappeared after a while, and things seemed to calm down. But now the smell of death was lingering. It smelled like roadkill that had been sitting out on the side of the road for hours. You know, that pungent rotting meat smell. You know it, if you've ever lifted the can of a trash can, and the smell wafts and hits you in the face. That's kind of what it smelled like, except it was kind of in and out in an odor all around and inside the house. Meanwhile, you can just feel this really heavy feeling, this energy lingering all around the house. Something, I don't know what it was, but something was outside the cabin that night. I was too afraid to go outside and look. I didn't want to see what was responsible for the noises or the smell. But as far as I know, we made it to the next morning, and the smells and the feeling completely dissipated. I believe that these spiritual beings, or these skinwalkers, are completely responsible for all of this. The eyewitness was born and raised during this era. During high school, his family owned a gas station in which he frequently worked as an attendant. It was always very busy, as you can imagine any gas station would be, and he often worked the night shift, surprising for a high schooler. One night, at about 1:50 in the morning, this car pulls up with 3 women in it. They seem very nervous and are whispering to each other frantically. He very friendly says hello. They jump out of the car and start trying to figure out how to open the locked door in the building. As he walked towards them, he could see that their eyes were completely black, like a pair of coals. He froze in fear as they zeroed in on him through their soulless eyes, terrifying him. But then one of them spoke, telepathically, asking him, "We're hungry. We need a human soul to take." The young man, completely panic-stricken, immediately runs and calls his father, comes in and asks him to help and pick him up ASAP. Well, his father came around the same time as an officer who was also luckily patrolling in the area. The officer walked up and asked what was going on. Of course, by the time the officer had got there, the 3 women and the vehicle were completely gone. The officer asked the young boy if they had security cam footage, in which they did. After going into the office and reviewing the footage, you can see the car pull up. You could see the girls getting out and trying to get into the store. You could see the young man approaching her, and her talking to him, and then him running away. And right after, you see the girl run back to the car, and the car drives off and kind of just vanishes off the camera. I mean, it doesn't just disappear off the camera frame, it literally goes transparent. The young boy and the officer were entirely shocked by what they saw, having no answers for what it is. The father relayed later on down the road to the officer that he had made some very bad, poor choices in his past, and believes that he has been hexed and cursed by a skinwalker. The father claims that ever since he was in his younger 20s, he's been followed around by several different people, all who are believed to be possessed by a skinwalker, the same one. When they come to him, they have solid black eyes and either threaten to hurt him or try to do something to his family. This was the very first time that his own son had encountered one of these beings. The son did not get a look at the male driver or any of the other two females in the car, but noticed that they all acted very strange, very out of place. Even the way they moved was very robotic and strange. The boy, who is now in his late 20s, is completely terrified. I was in the strip mines by the Four Corners area in an old abandoned mining camp, the same one my father used to work at. The roads around here are dirt. It was around 6 a.m. when suddenly, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It moved so fast, I could barely register its movements or form before it snagged a rabbit off the road, ripping into it with claws and teeth, then running back into the brush. I was shocked for a second and just kept on driving. I think what shocked me the most is its form. It appeared like a large walking coyote, not running. I'm talking walking on two legs, hocks and all, built like a canine, but not at all running around. Not the same way normal predators like that do. So about 10 minutes later, out of nowhere, this thing appears again on top of my car, peering down at me, huge head staring down. I've never been so scared in my life. It looked like some sort of coyote demon. It had really dark eyes. Not sure if they were red or black. I don't think they were red though. They were so dark. And it was so horrifying, I kind of blurred out a lot of the details. But I believe this was a shapeshifter. I sped up my car trying to throw this thing off the roof of my car, in which it jumped off into the tree next to me. I can only assume that this was some sort of demon or witch, either of which I don't want anything to do with. I had received a phone call from a good friend of mine that he was having a very toxic family situation and he needed somebody to come pick him up now. So, being the good, reliable friend I am, did just that. It was just like any other typical Wednesday night. It was raining, dark. I pull up to his house, honk the horn once. Probably not the most politest thing, but hey. He comes out, fuming. He's obviously very distressed. He gets in the car, and he starts to kind of go off and tell me about what happened. A little bit of a background story. He's adopted, and while the majority of his life has been very good, the last few years have been very hectic with his family. See, the dad, or his adopted father, got caught in an affair about 4 years ago, and the divorce is very, very brutal. It's also very lengthy, and the dad refuses to move out of the house, while the mom also refuses to move out of the house. They sleep in separate rooms, and it is a constant war zone. We were both only 16 and 17 at this time, so he was not quite old enough yet to move out. So we're sitting there talking and he's venting, and something catches my eye to the left. I notice these two eyes emerging from the timber directly ahead of me. The only reason I noticed it immediately was because my headlights, even through the fog and rain, are pointing right at the timber. And this thing slowly lets duck down, climbs up out of the trees, and fully stands erect, taller than my headlights shine. Whatever this was taller than 8 or 9 feet tall. Very lanky, very slender, very lean and tall. It looked like a starving coyote. At least, that's what it reminded me of. But the skin on its face and body seemed stretched, like its ribcage and skull was a lot more exposed. Not as if the skin had been torn open, but it just looked wrong, and it had this weird expression on its face. Obviously, we were both freaking out. My friend was screaming at me to start the car in a go. So I flip it in reverse and I fly backwards. This thing crouches down and jumps off, all the way to my left, so now it is completely out of view of the headlights now. I do a 180, and I fly back down the driveway, while my friend is looking behind us, making sure it's not following us at all. The conversation literally went from his family drama to what was that we just saw? Maybe it was a bear. I don't know. Is there anything else here living here that you know about? He doesn't. Either did I. And now he went from being distressed to scared to death. The drive back to my place, he was trying to be very analytical, thinking, okay, maybe it's just a bear with mange. There has to be an explanation for what we saw. Clearly this isn't something strange, right? Maybe we just dreamt it all. Yeah, we're just dreaming. I remember him saying that as if trying to lull himself into this false narrative that what we saw was not real. But there's no mistaking what it was. It was something that should not exist, nor should have existed. A lot of the car ride was silent, but he just kept trying to reassure him and myself that it's okay. We didn't really see it, it was just our eyes playing tricks on us. Maybe it was the stress manifesting itself in a physical way that caused both of us to see the same thing. I'd asked him if he really thought that. I even asked him if he had seen anything like that around his house before. He had not. He had not seen any tracks, anything. But he's not the type of guy to really go outside his house very much. He pretty much is a very introvert guy. Stays inside a lot, you know, those types. I think his conclusion, even though I disagree with him, is that it was some kind of bear. But looking at the thing, it looked nothing like a bear. It was far too elongated, far too skinny, and like I said, looked like a starving coyote, due to how exposed its ribs were and bones were, and how taut its skin was. It looked gross, to be honest. That night wasn't any easier. I offered him to stay in my room with me, since my parents were out of town, and I figured getting a night of rest with me would probably be a lot more beneficial to his mental health. Well, he stayed there with me, and the whole night he had these vivid, horrible nightmares. I can't even begin to describe what they were like. But the next morning, I took him to school with me. After school, I dropped him off back at his house, wishing him good luck and telling me to stay in contact. I guess things in the house kind of settled down for the time being. He never told me anything about seeing any of these creatures before, or finding more tracks or prints. Although I never pressed the issue. I never did want to know. This was kind of a one-time thing, and never again happened. I even brought it up a couple of years ago, and he seemed to kind of shoot it down immediately, like he either didn't remember it, or probably just did not want to talk about it. I guess who could blame him? I never believed in paranormal activity, that being ghosts and all that. I didn't care much for the paranormal or supernatural. It never really interested me. When my parents had told me about skinwalkers, though, it made them seem so genuine and all-knowing. They had always been a little too jumpy when we went on holiday trips through the forest or mountains, but they would tell me everything would be fine as long as I stayed close to whatever vehicle we were traveling in at the time. Now, like many children do with their parents, they tell old stories. They tend to ignore them or treat them as jokes. That was until I saw one with my own eyes, a skinwalker, during those days in May. It occurred first by having these horrible nightmares of being chased by this large black creature with large fangs. It would always hold me down and take a bite out of my neck. Not like a vampire. I'm talking rip chunks of flesh out of me. And it would be the same dream reoccurring every single night. It would have the same starting point, the same ending point, and the exact same point of fear and waking up. I was only 9 years old, and little did I know at that time that skinwalkers can actually pull a Freddy Krueger, infiltrate your nightmares, and infiltrate your body and mind with fear. During this trip, I was with my best friend. We'll call her Tasha. We decided to go on a walk through the forest up behind our house. It seemed like that's all we ever did during those days. We weren't too far out into our lives when this skinwalker first appeared, but I could tell it wasn't just your average animal wandering through. We were out playing building a fort, and we see this figure with large black eyes staring at us, holding onto a tree, kind of observing us closely. It looked very pale and sickly, but no doubt was some sort of canid on 2 legs, and not like a wolf. It was much more gaunt, kind of giving the impression it was starving. Tasha had grabbed onto my hand and I could feel her shaking like a small earthquake had passed through her. She whispered to me, Do you see that?" And I nodded my head slowly, recognizing what this creature was. It looked just like the drawings that my parents drew about the skinwalkers. They had been haunted by these beings too. And it turned its gaze back toward her, and then me, then back to her, and back to me again, almost in a very robotic fashion. And then it kind of opened its mouth, closed it, and disappeared behind a tree. I barely remember anything after that, but I can recall that we ran home, screaming, with Tasha. She never let go of my hand. That was when she did. We left the woods, and just before our street came into view on the back side of where our house is. I felt that had we not noticed that thing, it was going to do very bad things to us. I think we realized that once we saw it, it was spotted. I don't think it had meant to get spotted. I think it was accidental, like we had somehow foiled its plans. The impression I got was that it was kind of irritated it was seen, which is why it disappeared quickly. Also, I did not notice any foul scents or odors. Some people also reported change in the atmosphere, like a lot more electricity in the air, or a storm coming or passing, or during a storm. None of those things were the case. It was a bright sunny afternoon, in spring. Although my parents, that's a whole other thing. They would tell me these detailed accounts of how they were stalked and hunted by these strange upright creatures. My mom even has a sketchbook of them. It started while they vacationed down in New Mexico, and it's been happening on and off their adult lives. While it is terrifying, they've kind of just learned to accept it. And when they told me about it, it seems like whatever curse this thing is, whatever curse they brought upon themselves is now passed on to me. Hence the reoccurring nightmares and all that. But I feel like that soon kind of passed away, and I haven't dealt with that in a very long time. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, and around wild animals. I'm a firm believer in Native American mythology. Over the past year, my girlfriend and I have encounters with some form of something that is not quite human. We live just on the outskirts of the country, just along the outskirts of town. We're surrounded by thick hills, abandoned mines and fields. Despite all this emptiness, we always find ourselves running into something walking down the road late at night, when we least expect it, or even as we go walking through the woods when we want to get away from everybody, spending some much-needed time together. The first time we saw one of these things was actually last summer, while we were sitting outside our house watching the fireflies, looking up at the stars in the night sky. It seemed like nothing was there, until one of us kept looking back at the road in front of our house. Still nothing. We caught each other's eye for a second, before looking back at the road again. We saw it again this time. It did not seem to be aware that we could see it, though. It was just kind of standing there, observing us, trying to sneakily get closer, which I don't know why. As creepy as that is, why do these creatures always want to try and get close? Are they planning on attacking? Is there a reason they try to act stealthy as to not be seen? Because every time we've spotted one, they always seem to kind of go into a panic mode and quickly retreat, like their plans are squashed. But this night, neither one of us got a good enough look at what it is to describe what exactly we saw. I can tell you, though, how it sure made me feel. I have never had any sort of fear response like that in my life before, or since then. All the hair on my body and neck stood up on end, everything going cold and numb. My girlfriend would look over at me, asking if everything was okay with genuine concern. I looked so terrified all of a sudden, which was bizarre to see since I'm usually somebody who keeps their composure even in dangerous situations. I had joined the Marine Corps a year before. The only thing I could muster out of my mouth was to tell her, "We need to get inside right now." She stopped, looked at me very seriously, with ever-growing concern. But she knew me, how serious I was, and she did not treat it as a joke. She knew I did not mess around like that. I was not trolling. Safe to say, we spent the entire night up, each on opposite ends of the couch, with our weapons next to us. She kept asking me what happened until finally, I told her that it wasn't human, that this thing had large black eyes, that it was watching us, and its features were half animal, half man. It was simply trying to be stealthy and trying to keep from being seen. But once it noticed that I noticed it, that was it. It kind of laughed away and disappeared. And just in that moment, we started to hear sounds outside. Multiple sounds. It sounded like there were several people outside of our small house. I grabbed my gun, getting ready in case anything happened. My girlfriend at this point was now completely on edge, expecting anything and everything to happen. I got up, ran to the front door, and slowly tried to peek out the window. I could see dark shapes moving around, but could not tell who or what. The porch light was on, and the only other light nearby was a single streetlight, probably about 80 yards away from me, from where I currently was. So light was very, very poor. But you could hear something big moving around, multiples of them. And at one point, maybe 30 seconds passes, maybe a minute. It's hard to say. I feel like my heart was about ready to jump out of my throat. And this massive BAM crashes into the other side of the house. It sounded like somebody hit the house with a car. The house even shook slightly. It caused my girlfriend to start screaming, and I nearly fell over. I run to the back side of the house, right where the noise came from. This was right against our back bathroom wall, where there's a small window, like most showers do. Because it was dark outside, we didn't see anything, but we could hear whatever was outside moving around, stomping on things. It sounded very heavy, very tall, but we could also hear it kind of walking back towards the forest that was roughly maybe 40 to 50 yards away. My girlfriend was now hysterical, begging me to call our parents and to have us take us back. Anywhere but here, since we had just come from a family outing prior to this coming back here. I ran up to her, held her, comforted her, told her everything was going to be fine. Nothing was going to happen. And before I could finish my sentence, BAM! Another loud smack against the house. My girlfriend screamed again, falling down on the floor, crying, crouching, and running to the corner of the room. She runs and grabs a knife out of the kitchen, and now she's sitting there, rocking back and forth in the fetal position, screaming and crying, trying to call her parents. I'm thinking we're about to have a showdown here between the monsters of hell and me and my girlfriend. But within minutes, all the sound ceases, and even the crickets outside go completely silent. My girlfriend is now on the phone with her father, or my father-in-law, since we did eventually get married, but he wasn't my father-in-law at the time. He agrees to come pick us up, because my girlfriend slightly shares with him what's going on. He shows up about 20 minutes later, and my girlfriend and I devise a plan. We text him and say, "Let us know when you're in our driveway." He agreed. So about 20 minutes later, he shows up and says, "Hey, I'm in your driveway." My girlfriend and I hold each other, and on a count of 3, 1, 2, 3, and we both, as fast as we can, sprint from the front door and sprint to the back seat of her dad's car. We pile in, and her dad is a little freaked out looking. Obviously, all he knew was that his daughter was in hysterics, but he never actually knew specifically why. And he did not see anything around us. Even though the porch light was on and the street light was going behind us, there was no signs of anything creepy happening. So I think he was just more concerned than anything. My girlfriend and I were screaming at him, "Drive, drive, now, drive." And he just kind of questioned it, but put it in reverse and got out of there. I think my girlfriend just did her best to play it off as a large bear trying to get in the house, but I didn't say anything. I let her talk her way out of it. I knew they wouldn't believe us had I explained to them what we saw. Well, we came back the following evening, probably right about 4 or 5 p.m. It was after we had eaten an early dinner with the family. The sun was just about setting in the sky, and he dropped us off, ensuring everything would be okay with us, and we were good. We came back in the house, and my girlfriend noticed something outside, so she walks outside and sees a large scratch mark across the siding of the house. This is right where the bang was the night before, or I should say the secondary bang, which was closer to the front door. We have not seen or had any sort of encounter with these things since then. It's as if they simply just vanished and stopped bugging us altogether. Very, very odd. The witness of this encounter believes that they were entangled in a skinwalker sighting. Due to their lack of knowledge and experience with these types of beings, they're totally unsure. However, they believe it may have been something similar due to the details of their story. Additionally, rather than focusing on one specific moment within this narrative, this story provides readers with different experiences, all compiled into a longer narrative for easy comprehension. The first experience begins when my husband and I were up in Alaska with his side of the family in an Airbnb in Wasilla, right next to a lake. The witness and their husband were having fun with his family in an Airbnb located near a lake. The moment that this begins, there is already a sense of tension due to the fact that they are unsure that they will hear or see things during the time and location in which they were. Suddenly, almost immediately after, we heard a baby cry. And keep in mind, we don't have any kids staying with us or around us, which revealed why they believed it wasn't from children from their own family joining them on their trip. In addition, she also adds relief for readers since, although there was uncertainty surrounding these cries, it is unlikely that anybody's children would be performing an activity this late hour. This moment of relief is quickly taken away as the witness then explains how that baby cry moved around our small cabin. It was only a one-bedroom with an open living room, so there were no real walls or anything to stop it. This reveal adds fear to the situation. The sounds are not being blocked, which shows that these cries can move freely throughout the area. Whatever was making it was trying to entice, trying to get and invoke fear from its listeners. The second experience occurs when I woke up at around 2 a.m., hearing a very loud bang against our window right above my head. This event begins with a bang being heard against the window, causing the witness to become afraid, resulting in them waking up from their slumber. While it may be what occurred during this section of the narrative, it's not as unsettling as the other events that occurred prior. The third and final experience involved. My boyfriend got up to go use the bathroom, but I grabbed him, telling him it's probably not a good idea, that she just has a very bad feeling about it. He didn't listen to her, and went and used the bathroom anyway. Nothing happened, but said that as he left the room, she can just describe this dark energy almost coming inside the cabin, almost like it just enveloped and filled up the entire room. She started screaming for her boyfriend to come back, which he did, and was freaked out by her reaction. He asked her what was going on, and she explained to him what she felt. He stayed with her the entire time. This was all just one night. Over the course of the night, too, the witness heard more cries and screams out in the distance. Cries and screams that moved around and lasted all night long. Sometimes, it would appear right outside their window. Other times, it was far off in the distance. They never exactly found out what it could have been, but they do believe heavily this was the result of a skinwalker. My grandpa would take me hunting with him sometimes when I was just a kid. It was just something we enjoyed doing together, and I always had fun. Once, though, he took me out to this abandoned house in the outskirts of town, told me it's where skinwalkers live, and that they were nearby. We needed to be careful to make sure we didn't make any sudden movements or noise. We set up camp, and ended up hearing some kind of weird chanting coming from outside our circle of lanterns. We brought these along because it gets really dark really early. And then, like something out of a science fiction movie, we see these bright floating orbs, one landing on my grandfather's shoulder as he was claiming that this was the demonic energy of a skinwalker. It was really creepy to see. And in fact, the rest of that trip, we saw these strange large shadows watching us from the woodline. We never did find much elk or deer, which is what we were originally hunting for. Instead, we pretty much just got skinwalkers. We didn't catch any, we did not hunt any, but my grandfather tried shooting at one. It didn't do any good. We had to be very careful being around here. If you do the wrong thing, you will be cursed. My Skinwalker encounter story happened on the Navajo Res. I was living there at the time of my encounter, and it terrified me so much I had to leave. It's a very scary situation, not for people with weak hearts or feeble minds. As you know, I'm from Alaska originally, and have lived most of my life there until I moved down south to Arizona. That's where I met my wife. She's actually part Navajo, and has lots of family up there on the res, in the northern section of New Mexico. We took a liking to it, and at the time moved up there, just outside of Farmington, New Mexico. For 6 months or more, everything was just fine, moving into our new home. But then things began changing. It all began with some weird sightings of coyotes. I thought nothing much of it at the time, but as things continued to progress, more and more strange happenings were appearing everywhere. When my wife and I would go into the backyard, we'd see hairs hanging in the trees, feathers lying around everywhere, and these weird-looking paw prints left behind. These things alone were not so strange or necessarily frightening, but what really got me freaked out was one night, while my wife and I were sleeping, I woke up at about 3 in the morning, and to see this person standing over our bed, dressed in a black robe. This person turned around, staring right at me for a few seconds, then vanishing into thin air. It looked like a dead Native American, with paint on his face. After that, I began checking everything from outside before going inside, to bed, making sure nobody was anywhere. My wife and I were terrified by this sighting, but figured it was just a ghost, or something. Now, fast forward in the late fall of 2007, right after this thing appeared in our bedroom, just as it began getting dark. A lot of strange things began happening in the house. Like our Jack Russell Terrier got really sick with something it had never had before, and then died while we were at work one day. The house would always be freezing cold, even when we turned up the heat to 80+ degrees. All of our food would go bad. Worms would be crawling in and out of it. It was disgusting. It's like we were plagued by some sort of poltergeist. We heard this constant tapping on the front door every night for about 2 weeks straight. Then all of a sudden, it stopped. That made me feel relieved. I thought whoever or whatever had finally left us alone, so I can get back to some sort of normal routine. We were sitting in our living room, with my wife and I both see this coyote walking up to the back porch, stopping for a second or two, then walking away, back towards a large ravine. It was unusually large for a coyote, twice as big, kind of like a large wolf, with black fur mixed in. The thing that made me want to freak was I saw this animal's eyes. They were human-like. I still have nightmares thinking about that night. Ultimately, I really have no idea how to pinpoint down to the poltergeist I saw and this coyote. I'm looking for opinions here, even though I'm pretty convinced that this was a skinwalker. Both of them were. One was in ghost form, and the other was in shapeshifted form. Obviously, as I already stated, that was more than enough for us, and shortly thereafter, we moved out of there. So, what do you think it was? I'm pretty convinced it was a skinwalker, both times. Hi. Back in 2013, I had a strange encounter with something I can only describe as some kind of skinwalker. For the sake of this story, we're just going to call it an anomaly. It all started one evening while my family and I were heading to visit Area 51 in Nevada. We were having fun on our road trip. Then, we felt this weird sensation, like someone was watching me, but nobody else seemed to notice anything. As soon as that happened, though, everything changed. The desert started to get really dark. The sky went all weird, almost like the sun was night. It was very cold, and all I could see was what looked like shadows coming closer to the car we were in. As soon as they got really close, it seemed like time stopped for a second, and everything froze. This is where things got even more strange. Creatures came out of nowhere, out of the darkness, running up to our car, pressing their faces against the window, making everybody scream. The car was stopped to a halt. There was no indication of what these things were, or any specific characteristic about them. They all just looked ugly, distorted, and weird. The only other word I can use to describe them is emotionless. They didn't even seem alive. Have you ever seen Silence of the Lambs? You would probably know what I'm talking about when I use the term emotionless. After some time, we were all so terrified. I told my wife to slam on it, and she flew down the road. There were more of them coming after our car with this unusually dark night. That's when everything began clearing up, and just like that, it was back to evening time. Everything was gone, and we were all freaking out, screaming, wondering what had just happened. I don't know. A few weeks go by though, and I discovered yet another anomaly. This time, up in Ohio with a cousin who had also witnessed something similar when she was starting to drive, right before the same thing happened. Oh, quick note. My cousin told me about how her experiences are different than mine. She said their faces were visible, as if anything wasn't solid was there. As far as when I saw them in Nevada, my cousin claims that she saw more of them, coming down the mountainside. She said they were in front of her car and not just around them. The only thing I can think of is that we either had a mass hallucination, which I don't believe we did, or something paranormal from another realm or interdimensional attacked us or wanted to get us. Me as a family have never experienced anything so terrifying in our lives. How would you even describe the situation or experience to anybody without people giving you a look like they don't believe you? On a back road at night here in Nevada, I saw something I can't explain. I'll start this story off. I'm pretty open-minded. Yes, I believe in God, but I don't really like talking about my sighting on purpose. See, me and two other friends randomly decided to go out one night. So, we're driving around. We went down a back road that we had never been out there before. We drove for a while. It was dead silent. Then, right as we passed an old rundown house with a white trailer behind it, something crossed the road right in front of us. It moved incredibly fast across the road at what seemed like 10 feet in front of our headlights. It was very strange. You could see a human shape very clearly move quickly from left to right. Not running, but almost more of a jumping kind of motion over the ditch next to the road. Before we saw this thing, I was very skeptical about the existence of skinwalkers. We were all kind of worried to turn around. You never know what could be back there. So, we drove a mile or two down the road and were still pretty freaked out, but trying not to think too much about it. A few minutes later, and we go into a curve and slow down. That's when we see something on the other side of the road, from left to right, almost at the same place where we first spotted, well, whatever that thing was that we saw. As gross as this thing looked, it reminded me of some sort of giant rat that walked upright. I don't know. What killed the thought is the fact that we had all seen it well in our minds and will almost never forget it. It kind of held its arms below its knees, like how a primate would walk. When we saw this thing a second time, it stopped for a solid 3 seconds, then bolted back in the direction that it came from, which made us feel better about driving off and not turning around, just to see if something was behind us. Now, we still don't know exactly what these things were, but my friends and I have come up with some pretty good theories. My first theory is that they are outcasts from the Navajo tribe who have gone mad, and now are on a hunt to do revenge killing of some sort. Or, another theory could be that they are born and bred on the reservation. These skinwalkers can change form from anything to a human, deer, coyote, etc. So, this is mine and my friend's experience with something unexplainable. I'll say this: never go out at night, Nevada or alone anywhere for that matter. Keep your eyes peeled, and just because you don't believe doesn't mean it's not real. I was a senior in school in 2018, and we did a project about spiritual. I was a senior in my high school back in 2018. I was fortunate enough to do a project about spiritual creatures living in different places around the globe, all over the world. I'm doing as much research as I can concerning skinwalkers, so if anybody has any knowledge about it, please post a comment below. Let me know what you think. Anyway, there's an old Navajo legend that has been passed down for generations. It tells of a race of creatures that can shapeshift into anything they want or need to be in order to get whatever it is they are after. Shapeshifting was seen as the ultimate achievement one could make. Only people who possessed specific traits of magic could do this. They would wear animal skins and pelts, and they could become whatever creature their hearts desired, in hoping and avoiding detection from other magics who may cause them harm or reveal them if discovered. This way of life went unnoticed by non-magical humans, until one day, two young boys noticed something odd while out hunting with their father. When drifting back on the winds, they could hear the sounds of strange animals and odd hissing noises. One boy became curious. His father knew this, and rather than answer or investigate, he told them he was too close to chase such old things. These young boys decided they needed to see what these noises were. They followed the sound down a small hill until they themselves came face to face with a skinwalker. One man, whom we'll call Russell, claimed to have encountered one of these creatures himself while driving late at night through some rural areas. He declared that it looked like an older Navajo woman wearing traditional clothing. As Russell approached her on the deserted road, she began walking toward him, and as she walked, her appearance changed that from an old woman into something much more sinister. If Russ at all thought that would have been the end of it, he was wrong. As she changed into this new form, all sorts of things began flying from her body, all around his car. It was almost like a Dracula thing, where her body dematerialized into bats. After trying to escape, Russ finally outran the creature, who was in hot pursuit for most of the time. She had transformed into this hideous thing, running after his car. Although after a while, when he looked back, he could not see her anywhere, even though there was nothing that could have prevented his vision. Again, 1995, another family living near Farmington, New Mexico, reported seeing several skinwalkers at the front of their house. The rest of the story goes as follows. The mother and father had just awakened after hearing something outside their home, right around midnight. They both noticed something walking on two legs, but realized it was not a man. They weren't sure what it was. It was walking up and down, and had a very human shape. They were then able to see the face. It had long black hair, and a face kind of like a coyote. The dad quickly went to the door, grabbing his gun. The mother began screaming, and that's when they saw multiples of these things come towards the door very fast, trying to almost attack the father and break into the house. There's just story after story of these creatures out there, and I don't believe for a second any of this is just a figment of our imagination. Something is going on. I was born and raised on a reservation in Nevada. This is very true and very terrifying at times. Years ago, my mother told me that when she was little, her brother had told her to go play in the other room, so she did. Apparently, she had seen the spirit of a coyote with her mother outside. She was told later on that was just the spirit of her grandmother who had passed away years before. She had asked her brother how he knew about this, and he said that nobody told him. Years later, the mother told stories about seeing strange spirits lurking around the house at night, under the light of a full moon. I was able to ask other family members if they see these strange spirits too. All of them said yes. We have many mediums, clairvoyants, and psychics in our family, or so I'm told. I'll also never forget the one time I was riding around in town with my mother. We took a shortcut through some desert. As we were driving through, there's no trail, but we had taken this road many times. We were stopped, and I look off to the right and see these two coyotes coming towards us. All of a sudden, now they take off running towards us. My mom floors it, and they stand up on two legs running after our truck. She said that she could hear their claws on the side of the road as they're flying at the truck. Then all of a sudden, just as soon as they had appeared, they completely disappeared into thin air. Even though I haven't seen a skinwalker with my own eyes, yet I know some of these are crazy stories. I believe that I'm seeing skinwalker spirits. I'm not sure what they are. I've been reading up on the subject of skinwalkers now for many years. I'm still not really sure what to believe, but it's given me material for many campfire tales. One story that is true and happened just recently actually is that an old ranch hand was working by himself when he saw this strange being come out of some trees near an old tool shack. The person shapeshifted into a coyote, then back again to a human form as it came towards. He went inside and locked up. Hours later, the boss man came back in his truck with a friend who was some kind of Native American shaman or something. They wanted to know if he'd seen anything strange. Hours earlier, they had been out in the hills searching for some missing cattle and had found dozens of mutilated ones with strange symbols carved into them. That's when they suspected that it could be some sort of witch doing these killings. The boss told me after hearing that story that he does believe there are good Native American witches out there who help fight these bad witches, but it has to be a personal mission from within their hearts to do something like that. The one commonality among all these stories about skinwalkers is how they all state just how powerful they are. It seems impossible at times and makes you wonder how they could even be real. I know it's hard to believe, but the stories are coming from all over the world. So something has to be going on that cannot be explained by logic and reasoning alone. From the sounds of things, these beings are deeply embedded into a Native American culture as we speak. I have a ranch in Maverick County, Texas. It's very remote, and quite frankly, I'm not sure how I ended up with it. But the deed is in my name, so here I am. Let's just say it occurred from a little family mishap. Last year was the first time I had ever actually been down there. Prior to that, no one had ever lived on the land for years, and it was very overgrown. Lots of trees and brush and God knows what else. But you couldn't see any of that from satellite. I mean, we're talking dense vegetation. I know that's a weird analogy, but I'm just trying to iterate how dense the vegetation was. Anyway, before finally going out there myself, I had spent a lot of time talking to people who knew about the property, some of whom were pretty well versed in local folklore. The long and short of it is, I don't know what to expect. I figured it would be a lot of work, but if the rumors I'd heard were true, then the payoff could be worth it. And they were. There's plenty of open pasture, readily available for grazing and watering. The fences weren't in good shape, but some time and money could easily fix that. There were also dozens of little feeder streams that led down into the main creek, which crosses the property. Plenty of water for animals. It's perfect. The whole place looks like somebody just plopped down a large chunk of land and forgot to tell anybody about it. One guy even told me he thought at one point, during its time as an isolated ranch, locals would sneak out there at night and drive their cattle across it, on the way into Maverick County from Starr County. Remember, I'm talking about a place that was completely overgrown. Nobody would have been able to see them doing it. I've got several hundred acres fenced off for grazing, but in the middle of my land is this one little spot which has been left untouched by animals or humans. There's no grass or low-lying plants of any kind, just hard stone and dirt. It's an area that measures maybe 15 feet across at its widest point, and is shaped like a perfect square. As soon as I saw that weird patch of ground, when I first went down there last year, I knew immediately what it was. And I'm not talking about an old well or anything like that. This is much older than that. It's what the locals call a skinwalker place. The first time I set foot on my land was in late August of last year. It took me almost 3 months to get back down there. Again, I just started working a new job at a cattle ranch, which is almost an hour away from the property. In October, after finally getting around to checking out my land with some contractors and local guys who had experience building fences and such, we built a small house on top of one of the hills overlooking both pastures, where we could stay while doing work. Before I had the place fenced off, I used to see lots of deer. We also fixed up some of the fence and the gate. But other than that, the only thing we really did was cut down all the overgrown brush and trees where we planned on building a house. I left with nothing but good things to say. It's not very densely populated, especially when you're way out between there. It's one of the most beautiful places, as if you don't mind being away from civilization. The people out there are very friendly. It's a great place to kick back, getting away from it all, and do some hunting or fishing if that's your thing, which is what I was really after when I bought the land there in the first place. A quiet place off the beaten path where you can go to chill, relax, without having to deal with people constantly coming up to you or acting like they own you. The weather out there during the summertime is absolutely gorgeous. During my first trip down, it was inevitable that I'd have to go and visit. Weird things around the ranch began to happen. Weird symbols being etched into the ground, strange noises, and weird figures moving about. I normally don't believe in the paranormal, but I can't exactly explain what it was that I was seeing or experiencing. After a couple of days down there, a few of the workers I had fixing and patching up the fence were too afraid. They stopped altogether and left. I never saw some of those guys again. I decided to rough it out and try to get more men up on the ranch, but same thing. They reported seeing strange figures and weird noises, and that it spooked them so badly, they refused to work there any longer. I was only able to stay there for so long, before ultimately having to go back home. After I flew back home, I had contracted a separate team from out of state to show up there and fix the property up, while I was back home in a different state. I kept getting phone calls. Same thing. Workers would get up and leave during the middle of the day and night due to the same complaints as the other previous men. Then I get a very interesting phone call. This is where things get strange. The man I could tell was native, just from the way he talked. He claimed he was a medicine man from one of the local tribes. And forgive me because I can't remember the tribe in which he was a part of. But he said to me that he was a medicine man and that the land I owned, which he got my credentials and information from some of the men he saw working there, was sacred land, and many of his people had died there long before. He said his people still roamed about and that it's not safe that I have a house being built on it. He told me it would probably be in my best interest to abandon any development and let the property go back. As you can imagine, I was a bit taken aback by this phone call as I wasn't really sure what to believe. But after getting on the internet and doing a little bit of research on Google, I found out that there was some really weird stuff going on with not only that property but that whole sector of land. I'm a little bit short on time right now, so I'll have to write you into this as a part 2 if you don't mind. But for the time being, if you have any questions or comments about what's going on, I would love to hear them. I still own the property as of now, of August of 2021, and I'm debating whether or not to sell it or give it away to one of my other family members. I don't know if I want to deal with this, but anyway, like I said, I'll write into you part 2 about more of the strange things that have been happening there.